What would you do if one day you found out that the person you publicly humiliated actually controls your destiny? The silver maple bloomed in the Columbus, Ohio, evening gloom like a jewel set in a frame of brick and glass. Soft jazz wafted from the ceiling, playing with the reflections in the crystal glasses that Caitlin Murphy arranged on the crisp white tablecloth. 8 months of working at the state's most prestigious restaurant had taught her to move among opulence with the grace of a dancer. But inside, an ember of resistance still smoldered. A table for 4, Cristal champagne, oysters, and a check for $2,000, Caitlin said in a low voice, passing the order to Jason, the bartender with the hands of a pianist and the eyes of a tired philosopher. And all this for dinner, while somewhere 20 miles away, families are eating pasta for the 3rd day in a row. Jason winced. Are you starting again? One more political speech, and Martinez will fire you. For what? For thinking. Caitlin straightened her perfectly ironed uniform blouse. I smile at every millionaire as if he were Jesus. Come down to see how things are going, but no one can stop me from thinking. Your thoughts are too loud, Jason poured a perfect Manhattan and winked. And your Twitter, too. Caitlin rolled her eyes. At 27, she found strange pleasure in leading a double life, servicing Ohio's political and business elite by day and tearing them apart by night on her blog, The Inside Story of America. Followers appreciated her scathing reports from the predator's den, as she called it, where a bottle of wine cost as much as a month's rent on her apartment. The front door of the restaurant opened, letting in a blast of cool October air. Caitlin turned, automatically preparing a professional smile, and froze. He shouldn't have been here. No security, no press secretary, wearing plain jeans and a blue wool sweater. His hair was slightly damp from the drizzle, his leather jacket slung casually over his shoulders. James David Vance, the Vice President of the United States, stood at the entrance to the Silver Maple, looking more like a professor after a long day of lecturing than the second man in the land. Oh my God, Jason breathed, spilling his whiskey. This is... I see, Caitlin snapped, feeling her heart pounding its way into her throat. The gym manager, Martinez, was already gliding toward the entrance with the grace of a cobra preparing to strike. Mr. Vice President, it is a great honor for us. His Spanish accent became more noticeable with excitement. Vance smiled a calm, slightly tired smile. Thanks, but I'm just JD today. Table for 1, if possible. Something in the corner. Martinez was full of assurances. Caitlin watched as they moved through the room. Patrons paused, recognizing the vice president, but none dared approach. Something about his posture, the way he carried himself through the space, created an invisible barrier. Table 6 is your sector, Jason whispered, nudging her with his elbow. What? Caitlin turned, feeling the blood drain from her face. No, let Rachel take it. Rachel's servicing the senator in the VIP area. Jason looked at her with undisguised amusement. What is it, Caitlin? I'm afraid of nobody, Murphy. Is the vice president scarier than all those bankers you service every day? You know what I wrote about him. Caitlin clenched her fists. In my last article, I called him the architect of social Darwinism in the new government. I don't think he reads waitress blogs. Jason handed her the menu. Go, or Martinez will think you're sabotaging the job. Caitlin took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and moved toward the table where Vance had already settled in, studying the menu. Halfway there, she found herself thinking that the vice president looked more human up close. Television cameras always gave him a predatory look. Sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, impeccable suits. Here sat a man with a slight gray at the temples, wrinkles around his eyes, and a weariness that even his perfect manners couldn't hide. Good evening, Mr. Vice President, Caitlin said with carefully measured professionalism. My name is Caitlin, and I will be your guide to the Silver Maple menu today. Vance looked up, and Caitlin felt an unexpected shock. His eyes were different from the photographs. More alert, more alive, as if he were actually seeing a person in front of him, not just a decoration. Caitlin, he nodded, I'm just JD today, if that's okay. What would you recommend to someone who hasn't eaten since 6 this morning? Caitlin hesitated. The question was simple, but something about the way he phrased it was jarring. He was speaking to her as an equal, without the condescension she expected. The chef is proud of his filet mignon with truffle puree, she answered automatically. But if you prefer something less pretentious, our rosemary farm chicken with seasonal vegetables is home comfort done to perfection. Vance smiled, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepened. Less pretentious. I like your honesty, Caitlin. Chicken sounds great. And a glass of your local beer, please, if you have it. Local beer? Caitlin couldn't hide her surprise. We have a great wine list. I grew up in Middletown, Vance shrugged. Old habits die hard. Some local craft brew would be perfect. Caitlin nodded and stepped back. Something wasn't adding up. James David Vance, the man she'd come to regard as the epitome of elitism, was ordering chicken and beer instead of foie gras and champagne. After bringing the order, she watched as the vice president took his first sip of beer with visible pleasure. Columbus Brewing Company, he said, studying the label. Excellent choice. They started out as a small family brewery, Caitlin said, not quite sure why she was continuing the conversation. And now they employ over 200 people. I know, Vance put down his glass. I helped them get a federal grant 3 years ago when they were facing a supply crisis. Caitlin froze. This wasn't in her research on him. In her mind, she ran through every article she'd read about the vice president, his conservative stance on tax policy, his outrageous comments about social programs, his hardline stance on immigration, nothing about supporting small businesses. It wasn't publicized, Vance added, as if reading her mind. Some things aren't done for the headlines. Caitlin felt a wave of conflicting emotions rise up inside her, her fingers tightening on the notebook more than necessary. If you need anything, let me know, she said and turned to leave. Actually, Vance's voice stopped her. I'd be interested to know what you think of the latest tax initiative for small businesses. You seem like a man with a mind of your own. Caitlin turned slowly. There was genuine interest in the vice president's eyes, and it was disconcerting. She glanced across the room to see Martinez watching them, his face set in an expression of professional courtesy that was clearly tense. I'm afraid political discussions are not on the menu, Mr. Vice President, she replied cautiously. I'm just JD. Today, remember? He cut off a piece of chicken. And I'm not asking for the restaurant's official position. I'm interested in Caitlin Murphy's opinion, if she's willing to share it. Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. How did he know her last name? The badge only had her first name. Darwin, where are you from? I'm prepared for meetings, he answered simply. Habit. Caitlin felt a chill run down her spine. What else did he know? Had he read her articles? Had he seen her tweets calling him a privileged aristocrat with no understanding of the problems of everyday Americans? Tax breaks for small businesses sound good on paper, she finally said, taking a chance. But in practice, they often go to those who are already successful and have access to good accountants and lawyers. Small family businesses are drowning in bureaucracy. Vance nodded, his gaze becoming thoughtful. A fair point. What would you suggest? Caitlin blinked. She hadn't expected the vice president to actually ask her opinion. I'm not an economist, she began cautiously. Sometimes it's the people outside the system who see things we miss, Vance replied. Don't be shy, Caitlin. You couldn't say it any worse than some of my advisors. She felt the tension ease a little. Perhaps it was just another political ploy, pretending to care about the opinions of ordinary people. But something in his gaze seemed sincere. Direct subsidies for the first year of operation, said Caitlin. Not tax deductions that come at the end of the year, when the business may already be bankrupt. Direct support at the time of launch so that people can breathe while they build their business. Vance took a sip of beer and looked at her with new interest. You sound almost like my father. He always believed that government should invest in people, not just cut taxes. You can't save on what you don't have, he said. Caitlin froze. This was not what she expected to hear from a man known for his conservative rhetoric. It sounds different in your interviews, the words escaped before she could stop them. Vance chuckled, but without malice. Interviews rarely tell the whole story, do they? He put down his fork. Tell me, Caitlin, do you believe everything you read in the papers? I write for an online publication myself, she replied, deciding to be honest, and I try to check the facts. Edition? The vice president looked interested. Which one? Caitlin swallowed. The moment of truth. The Other Side of America, she said, expecting his face to change when he recognized the name of the blog that regularly criticized the administration. But Vance only nodded with a slight smile. Truth is to look at things from all sides, he quoted. Your motto, if I'm not mistaken. An interesting choice of Emerson for a political blog. Caitlin felt her cheeks heat up. He didn't just know about her blog, he read it. Have you read my articles? Her voice was quieter than she intended. A few, Vance answered calmly. I especially remember the one where you compared me to the architect of social Darwinism. A colorful comparison, though not entirely accurate. The world around Caitlin seemed to freeze. Somewhere in the back of the restaurant, glasses clinked and music played, but it all seemed distant and unreal. The vice president knew about her criticism, knew who she was, and yet he was acting normal? She began, not knowing what to say. You don't need to apologize for your position, Vance interrupted. In a democracy, criticism is healthy. I'd rather have a world where people say what they think than one where everyone is afraid to open their mouth. Caitlin looked at him, unsure how to react. It was not the reaction she expected from a man of his position and political views. Although I must admit, he continued with a slight smile, some of your assumptions about my personal history, let's say they are somewhat at odds with reality. Like what? Caitlin asked unexpectedly. Vance took another sip of beer. Like, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and never knew what it was like to fight for survival. His voice remained level, but his eyes darkened slightly. My mother was a junkie, Caitlin. I grew up in Appalachia, where most kids don't dream of college or a career. They dream of their parents being sober for Christmas. Caitlin froze. Sure, she'd read his official biography, knew about his background, but hearing it from him, seeing the shadow in his eyes, it was something else entirely. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, she began. Don't apologize for not knowing, he replied. Just remember that behind every public image is a person with a story you may not fully understand. Their conversation was interrupted by a quiet ringing of the phone. Vance took it out, glanced briefly at the screen inside. Duty calls. Even on a day off. Caitlin nodded, feeling strangely disappointed. Do you want me to bring the bill? Please, he said, putting the phone away. And Caitlin, I'd appreciate it if you didn't publish the details of our conversation. Not because I'm afraid of anything, but because sometimes it's nice to be able to speak as a person, not as a political figure. She nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of shame and confusion. Part of her was already planning a story about the unexpected encounter with the vice president, about how different he was from his public image. Of course, she replied. This will remain between us. Caitlin returned to the bar for the check. Jason glared at her. Well, what did he say? Did he recognize you? Not now, she snapped, still trying to digest the conversation. As she was filling out the bill, Caitlin noticed out of the corner of her eye that Martinez had approached the vice president's table. They exchanged a few words with the manager looking unexpectedly tense, and then Vance typed something into his phone. When she returned to the table with the check, the vice president was already standing, throwing on his jacket. Thank you, Caitlin. The food was excellent, and the company was unexpectedly pleasant. He handed her a credit card. I'd appreciate it if you'd close the tab. Of course, Mr. Vice President. She accepted the card, trying to remain professional, despite the storm in her head. JD, he corrected with a slight smile. At least today. After swiping her card, Caitlin noticed that Vance had left a generous tip, 40% of the bill. She brought him the receipt. Thank you very much for the tip. It is very generous. My grandmother was a waitress, he said simply, signing the check. She taught me to respect people who do their jobs with dignity. Vance stood up. It was nice meeting you, Caitlin Murphy. Perhaps in your next article, you'll find me a more accurate comparison than architect of social Darwinism. With that, he headed for the door. Caitlin watched him go, feeling strangely numb. Only when the door closed behind him did she notice that on the back of the check was a note. Check your mail tonight. I have a proposition for a journalist who isn't afraid to speak his mind. JDW. Martinez appeared next to her so suddenly that she jumped. Caitlin, I need to talk to you. Right now. In my office. A chill ran down her spine. The manager's face was impassive, but there was something frightening in his eyes. Did something happen? She asked, trying to stay calm. It's about your blog, Martinez said quietly, and your conversation with the vice president. Caitlin felt the ground shift beneath her. How did Martinez know about her blog, and why did it matter? The manager leaned closer. Do you know who owns the controlling interest in Silver Maple, Ms. Murphy? Her heart sank. No, it couldn't be. It would be too cruel an irony of fate. The Ohio Revival Investment Fund, Martinez continued, founded by James David Vance 7 years ago, long before his political career. The room spun around Caitlin. All her articles, all her harsh comments about the vice president rushed through her head. All this time, she had been working at the restaurant he owned, and he knew it. He knew about her, and yet he spoke to her as an equal, as someone whose opinion mattered. He's going to fire me. Her voice sounded hoarse. Martinez smiled mysteriously. Actually, no. He just called me and said something quite unexpected. Chapter 2. Revelation. The Silver Maple manager's office resembled a ship's cabin, compact, functional, yet graceful. Caitlin stood in the middle of the room, feeling the ground beneath her feet turn to quicksand. Martinez sank into a leather chair behind a dark wood desk where photographs of his family sat alongside the restaurant's awards and certificates. Sit down, Miss Murphy. His accent thickened, as it always did when he was nervous. Caitlin slowly sank into the chair. Explain it to me again. Vice President Vance owns this restaurant? Not exactly, Martinez cupped his hands. His investment fund, Ohio Revival, is the majority owner, and he's the founder and chairman of the fund. Technically, he's not the sole owner, but he's my boss, Caitlin finished, feeling reality warp around her. And all this time he knew who I was? Knew about my blog? Martinez looked away, which was an answer in itself. I can't say when exactly he found out, but this morning I received a notification from the foundation's office that the vice president was planning to visit the restaurant incognito. A routine check. But there was one detail. He opened the desk drawer and took out a sheet of paper. It says here, provide waitress Caitlin Murphy for Mr. Vance's service. No explanation, no comment. Caitlin felt the room spin. This was no chance encounter. He had come specifically for her. Oh my God, she whispered, remembering all her tweets and articles. A recent blog entry flashed through her mind with blinding clarity. J.D. Vance is the epitome of elitist cynicism, a man trying to build a political career on the tail of his difficult childhood while his investment funds suck the middle class dry. I'm fired, right? She looked up at Martinez, oddly resigned to the inevitable. The manager frowned. You know, Ms. Murphy, I thought that would be the case. I had already started preparing the documents when the vice president sat down at the table. But after your conversation, he called me personally. Martinez pulled out his phone and showed the last incoming call marked DV. And he said the following. I enjoyed our conversation with Ms. Murphy. Please tell her that I appreciate people who are not afraid to tell the truth, even if it is not the truth I want to hear. Caitlin blinked. What? And then he added, Martinez continued, consulting his notes, and tell her I expect her tomorrow at 10 in the morning in my office at the state capitol. If she's so worried about the future of this country, maybe she should learn how this country works from the inside. Tell her this isn't a request or a demand. It's an opportunity. Caitlin stared at the manager, trying to process what she had just heard. It was like a dream, a surreal, impossible dream. The state capitol? Why? Her voice sounded alien, as if it belonged to someone else. Martinez shrugged. He didn't say that, but I've worked with powerful people long enough to know that when the number 2 person in the country invites you to a meeting, it's wise to accept. Caitlin stood up, feeling her legs shake. I need to check something. She pulled her phone out of her uniform apron pocket and opened Google. James David Vance, Ohio Revival Investment Fund. The first article backed up Martinez's words. The Ohio Renaissance Foundation, founded by then entrepreneur J.D. Vance in 2018, continues to expand its presence in the hospitality and local industries, most recently acquiring a majority stake in the upscale Silver Maple restaurant in Columbus. 8 months ago, Caitlin whispered, looking at the date on the article. Exactly when I started working here. She flipped through the image gallery and found a photo from the restaurant's reopening after the change in ownership. In it, Vance, not yet a vice president, but a successful investor and writer, stood next to Martinez, shaking his hand. They smiled at each other like old acquaintances. You knew him before? Caitlin began, looking up at the manager. Yes, Martinez said softly. Mr. Vance gave me this job when I first came from Mexico. Few people wanted to hire an immigrant for a management position, even with my experience. But he said that in America, it's not your roots that matter, it's what you can grow. Caitlin shook her head, feeling her idea of the vice president cracking. It doesn't fit with his public position on immigration, she muttered. Politics is a complicated game, Ms. Murphy. Martinez stood up. And what we see from the podium does not always reflect a person's true views. He must say what his electorate wants to hear. But in personal matters, the manager spread his hands. Actions speak louder than words. Caitlin put her phone away, feeling a strange mixture of shame and confusion. Awkward. So what now? I'm not fired. Not at all, Martinez walked to the door. You can return to your duties, although, he allowed himself a thin smile, perhaps you should check your mail, as he suggested. Caitlin walked out of the office feeling like she had entered an alternate reality. She automatically walked through the kitchen and found herself at the service exit where employees usually took smoke breaks. The cool Columbus evening air sobered her up a bit. Leaning against the brick wall, she pulled out her phone and opened her email. A new email glowed at the top from an unknown sender with the address jedvarenewalohio.gov. With a trembling finger, she pressed on it. Miss Murphy, I hope our meeting today has not disturbed your worldview too much. I found our conversation refreshingly honest, a quality that is rare in my current circle. You wonder why I haven't fired you for your articles and tweets about me? The answer is simple. I value critical thinkers. Your analysis, while based on incomplete information, demonstrates insight and a passion for justice. My offer to meet tomorrow is not a ploy or an attempt at intimidation. It is an invitation to see politics from the inside. A day in my office, observing the real decision-making process, may give you more material for criticism or perhaps change some of your views. In any case, your job at the restaurant is not in danger. I don't believe in punishment for free thought. Sincerely, J.D. Vance. Caitlin read the letter 3 times, trying to find a hidden threat, a catch, anything that would fit her idea of a vice president. But there was none. What game is he playing? She whispered into the void. The door swung open and Jason walked out onto the porch with a cigarette in his hand. There you are. The whole restaurant is buzzing. Is it true that Vice President Vance personally invited you to the meeting? News travels fast, Caitlin sighed, putting her phone away. Will you accept the invitation? Jason lit a cigarette. I don't know. She rubbed her temples. This is all crazy. I wrote things about him, Jason. I compared him to... I called him... I know, the bartender blew out a stream of smoke. I read your blog, remember? And now he's my boss, Caitlin said, leaning against the wall. And I was just having a discussion with him about tax policy like it was normal. Like I didn't just call him a privileged sociopath 2 weeks ago. Jason laughed. Life is funny, huh? Not the word, she shook her head. So what should I do now? Go to this meeting? Why not? Jason raised an eyebrow. Think about it. How many bloggers get a personal invitation from the vice president? This is your chance to ask him the questions no one else is asking, to put him on edge. Or be destroyed by his security service, Caitlin joked darkly. Don't be dramatic. He doesn't seem like a vengeful person. Otherwise, you would already be looking for a new job. Maybe this is his way of silencing me, intimidating me from within the system. Jason took a drag. Or maybe he's just interested in people who say what they think. You heard how he grew up. People like that usually appreciate directness. Caitlin thought about it. Her phone vibrated again. Another notification. This time not email, but Twitter. Someone had tagged her in a post. She opened the app and felt the blood drain from her face. The vice president's official account reposted her latest blog post, a scathing critique of the administration's handling of student debt, with the caption, "Interesting perspective from K. Murphy unveiled, raises important questions that deserve discussion. We should not be afraid of honest criticism." Oh my God, she breathed, showing the screen to Jason. Is this real? The bartender whistled. Looks like you've got some attention at the very top. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Her phone exploded with notifications. Followers, media accounts, all reacting to the vice president's repost. Suddenly, her little blog had a national platform. My elementary school principal used to say, "Be careful what you wish for," Caitlin muttered, watching the notifications grow. I always wanted my voice to be heard. And then... Your voice has been heard by the second man in the country, Jason finished with a smile. And now you need to decide what you want to tell him. Caitlin opened her Twitter page and gasped. She had gained over 3,000 new followers in the last 5 minutes. Her latest article, which had barely gotten a couple hundred views, was now being shared in the thousands. This is crazy, she whispered. It's politics, Jason shrugged. You hit a nerve, and now you're in the game. Caitlin was about to respond, but was interrupted by an insistent ringing. An unfamiliar number with a Washington area code. Hello? She answered uncertainly. Caitlin Murphy? A female voice said with professional politeness. My name is Sarah Chong, and I am Vice President Vance's press secretary. I am pleased to inform you that a pass has been arranged for you to enter the state capitol tomorrow. A driver will be waiting for you at your home at 9:30 a.m. At my house? Caitlin repeated, confused. But how? We understand this is an unusual situation, Sarah continued. But the vice president is interested in your perspective on several current initiatives, especially after your latest article on student debt. Caitlin felt her knees go weak. Thank you, but how did you find out my address? Short pause. Miss Murphy, the vice president of the United States has access to certain resources. Sarah Chong's voice took on a steely edge. If that bothers you, we can arrange a meeting in a more neutral location. No, it's okay, Caitlin said quickly, feeling her resistance melt away. It's unexpected. Politics is often unexpected, Ms. Murphy, Sarah said, a hint of a smile in her voice. Can you confirm the meeting? Caitlin looked at Jason, who was nodding vigorously. Yes, she finally answered. I'll be ready by 9:30. Excellent. And Ms. Murphy, if you have any questions you'd like to ask the vice president, please have them ready. He appreciates a straight talk. The call ended. Caitlin slowly lowered the phone. What's going on, Jason? she asked, feeling reality slipping through her fingers. I've been waitressing all day, criticizing the government on my tiny blog that maybe 1,000 people read. And now you're on the radar. The bartender stubbed out his cigarette. Congratulations, Caitlin. You just got what every internet activist dreams of. Real influence. Or a trap, she added. The door opened again and Rachel came out onto the porch. Caitlin, you won't believe it. CNN just published an article with the headline, Vice President Vance singles out administration critic from little-known blog. Your name is in it. Caitlin turned pale. What? Rachel handed her phone over. Sure enough, there was a headline on the screen mentioning her name and blog. Oh, God, she breathed. It happened so fast. The phone vibrated again. The editor of a small progressive publication, for which she sometimes wrote, was trying to get through. They all want to comment, Caitlin whispered, looking at the growing list of missed calls. Jason put his hand on her shoulder. Hey, breathe. That's what you wanted, isn't it? To be heard? Caitlin took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Yes, but not like that. Not because of him. Not because my boss happened to be the vice president I was criticizing. What difference does it make why? Jason shrugged. What matters is what you do with the opportunity. Are you going to use this meeting to ask him real questions? Or are you going to be afraid? Rachel looked from one to the other with curiosity. What are you talking about? What meeting? The vice president has invited Caitlin to a private meeting tomorrow, Jason explained, in his office in the Capitol. What? Rachel's eyes widened. Seriously? Why? Good question, Caitlin muttered, checking her phone again. Her personal Twitter account exploded. Tens of thousands of new followers, hundreds of comments, reposts from major political accounts. Her world turned upside down in about half an hour. I have to go home, she decided. I need to think. Prepare. Are you really going to go? Rachel looked worried. What if this is some kind of trap? What trap? Jason couldn't help but ask. He's the vice president of the United States, not the head of the mafia. What can he do? Make her sign non-disclosure agreements? Caitlin suddenly froze, remembering Vance's words in the restaurant. I would appreciate it if you didn't publish the details of our conversation. That's it, she whispered. He was testing me, seeing if I would keep my word. What are you talking about? Rachel asked. He asked me not to write about our conversation. Caitlin put her phone away. And now he's reposted my article and invited me to his office. He's testing whether he can trust me. And can I? Jason raised an eyebrow. Caitlin paused. Her journalistic instincts screamed for a scoop, for a candid conversation with the vice president to take her blog to new heights. But something about the look in Vance's eyes, the way he talked about his childhood, made her doubt it. I don't know, she answered honestly, but I think I'll find out tomorrow. Rachel shook her head. You're playing with fire, Kate. These people, they're not like us. They have different rules. Maybe, Caitlin picked up her bag, but if I want to change anything, I need to understand these rules, and maybe learn to use them. The phone rang again. This time it was her mother. Caitlin Elizabeth Murphy, came a worried voice as soon as she answered. Why am I hearing on the news that my daughter is suddenly a political commentator being noticed by the vice president? Mom, now's not the best time. Caitlin began to make her way to the exit of the alley. I'll explain everything later. Channel 7 just showed your picture. Mother was not calming down. They said that you are some kind of protest blogger who attracted the attention of the administration. What is going on, Caitlin? I'm trying to figure it out myself, Mom, she sighed. Look, I really have to go. I'll call you later, I promise. She ended the call and walked outside. To her horror, Caitlin saw a local news station van parked across the street from the restaurant. A reporter with a microphone was already interviewing Martinez as he walked in. Shit, she muttered, quickly pulling up the hood of her jacket and turning down a side street. Taxi? She needs a taxi, preferably right now. As if in response to her thoughts, a black SUV with tinted windows smoothly stopped next to her. The window rolled down, and Caitlin saw the stern face of a man in a dark suit. Miss Murphy, Vice Presidential Security. We've received information about a press gathering near your place of work and have decided to offer you transportation home. Caitlin felt her heart squeeze. What? How do you know what's going on? The man smiled faintly. That's our job, miss. Would you prefer a ride, or would you like to continue to be the center of attention in the local media? Caitlin glanced back to see a second van, bearing the logo of a major cable news channel, pulling up to the Silver Maple. Okay, she decided, opening the car door. Inside, the air conditioning was cool, and the smell of leather seats was there, a silence that was a stark contrast to the madness of the last hour. Your home address, miss? The driver asked without turning around. 432 Beekman Street, flat 7B, she answered automatically, and only then realized that these people probably already knew where she lived. The car moved smoothly, the agent next to it maintaining a professional silence. "May I ask," Caitlin finally said, "why is the vice president playing this whole game?" The agent turned to her. "A game, miss. Restaurant. My blog. A sudden repost and invitation. Why? What does he want from me?" The man studied her for a few seconds. "I'm not authorized to speak for the vice president, but in 3 years of working with him, I've noticed that Mr. Vance values authenticity, and he's not afraid of people who tell him the truth to his face." "Even if he doesn't like the truth?" Caitlin asked skeptically. "Especially if he doesn't like her," the agent replied without a trace of a smile. "There are too many people around him who say what he wants to hear." Caitlin leaned back in her seat. "This is weird." "What exactly?" "Everything. This day. The fact that I criticized him for months, called him not the nicest words. Elitist sociopath, trailer park manipulator, man who traded his roots for the seats of power," the agent said calmly. "We read your blog, Ms. Murphy. It's our job." Caitlin felt the color rise in her face. "And after all this, he reposts my article? Invites me to his office?" "As I said," the agent said evenly, "the vice president values authenticity, and perhaps he sees something in you that you don't see yet." The car stopped in front of the modest brick building where Caitlin rented an apartment. "We'll be here at 9:30 a.m., Ms. Murphy," the agent said, opening the door for her. "I recommend that you not take any press calls until after your meeting with the vice president. It's in your best interest." Caitlin stepped out of the car, feeling as if she were in a dream. The entire familiar world had suddenly transformed into a surreal political drama, with her at center stage. She paused at the door of her modest apartment building, noticing a small group of journalists positioned across the street. They hadn't yet seen her, and she quickly slipped inside, taking advantage of a moment of anonymity that would soon be gone forever. In her tiny apartment, Caitlin fired up her laptop and began searching for everything she could find about Vice President Vance beyond the cliched political headlines. She dug into the archives, read interviews from his pre-politics days, and studied his business and philanthropic endeavors. With each page she read, the caricature she'd created on her blog began to blur, giving way to a complex, contradictory, yet unexpectedly sincere figure who'd risen from poverty to power. As the clock ticked, Caitlin continued to delve deeper, trying to figure out whether the vice president's invitation was a trap, an opportunity, or maybe something more. A chance to change not just her life, but the system she'd spent so long railing against. The Ohio State Capitol towered over Columbus like a monument to power, carved from limestone and political ambition. To tourists, it was an architectural landmark. To locals, it was a symbol of nationhood. To Caitlin Murphy, standing at its foot at 9:45 a.m., it was the boundary between her old life and something entirely unknown. "Miss Murphy," nodded the same agent who had brought her home yesterday. Today he looked even more unapproachable in a perfectly pressed dark suit. "Follow me." Caitlin clutched the strap of her bag, where she kept a notebook of questions she'd been writing until 3 a.m. She'd barely slept, processing the surrealism of the situation and bracing herself for possible scenarios. From regretting her articles, never, to attempting the most candid interview of her life, maybe. She passed through security without any problems. Apparently they were already expecting her. Instead of the usual visitor's elevator, she was led to a private elevator used only by the highest ranks. The mirrored walls reflected her pale face and the dark circles under her eyes, which she tried unsuccessfully to hide with makeup. "Are you nervous?" the agent suddenly asked, breaking his stoic silence. "Should I?" Caitlin tried to keep her voice even. "No," he answered simply. "The vice president doesn't bite, contrary to what some blogs say." She caught the shadow of a sardonic smile on his face. "Are you quoting me?" "Perhaps," the agent looked straight ahead. "Your article, Fangs Behind the Smile, the administration's predatory economic policy, was colorful." Caitlin felt her ears burning. "You seem to know my work better than my subscribers." "We are thorough in our work, Miss Murphy." The elevator stopped at the 6th floor. The doors slid silently open, revealing a spacious hallway with dark wood paneling and portraits of political figures from the past. "The vice president's office is at the end of the corridor." The agent gestured with his hand. "They're expecting you." Caitlin took a deep breath. "You're not coming with me?" "There'll be another agent at the door." "Good luck, Miss Murphy." He held her gaze. "And a word of advice. Be yourself. The vice president values candor more than you might think." With that, the elevator doors closed, leaving Caitlin alone in the quiet hallway of power. Her heels were too loud on the marble floor, each step echoing off the walls. As she approached the double doors at the end of the hall, she saw a woman at an elegant mahogany desk. "Caitlin Murphy?" the woman asked with a perfect smile. "Sarah Chong, we spoke on the phone yesterday. The vice president is expecting you." Sarah rose from the table, short, with impeccable posture, and a look that could both dispose and assess. "Are you worried?" she asked, leading Caitlin to the door. "I'm still trying to figure out why I'm here," Caitlin answered honestly. Sarah stopped in front of the door. "The vice president will explain himself. Are you ready?" Caitlin checked her bag again, straightened her blouse, and nodded. "Sorry, ready to written." "Ready." Sarah opened the door and announced, "Miss Murphy has arrived, sir." The vice president's office was not as pompous as Caitlin had expected. It was spacious but not huge, with large windows overlooking the town square. Bookshelves lined two walls, and the third was filled not with political regalia, but with black and white photographs of Ohio's industrial towns, the very ones Vance had come from. The vice president himself was standing by the window, looking out over the city. He was wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, no tie, and a cup of coffee in his hand. When he heard Sarah's announcement, he turned and smiled, the same quiet smile he had in the restaurant. "Miss Murphy," he stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." She shook his hand, noting that it was firm but not aggressive. "Mr. Vice President," she nodded. "Please, JD," he pointed to the chair across from his desk, "at least while we're away from the cameras." Sarah left, closing the door behind her. Caitlin sank into a chair, feeling the tension in her shoulders. Vance sat across from her, sipping his coffee. "Should I offer you something? Coffee? Tea?" "I'm fine, thank you." Caitlin placed her hands on her knees to keep them from shaking. "Mr. JD, may I ask why I'm here?" Vance leaned back in his chair. "Because I appreciated your blog and our conversation yesterday. You asked the right questions, even if sometimes you come to the wrong conclusions." "Wrong conclusions?" Caitlin felt a familiar stab of irritation. "For example, about my motives," Vance answered calmly. "You wrote that my policies are aimed at protecting the interests of large corporations at the expense of the working class. But has it ever occurred to you that long-term stability for business creates the basis for sustainable jobs?" Caitlin swallowed. "The trickle-down theory doesn't work. Statistics show—" "I know the statistics," Vance interrupted gently. "I grew up seeing the effects. But there's a huge gap between mere slogans and real economic policy." He put his cup down. "Do you know why I started Ohio Revival, Caitlin?" She shook her head. "To invest in local business? To create a model of economic development that is not dependent on the political situation?" He answered. "I grew up in a city that was dying before my eyes when the factories closed. I saw people lose not only their jobs, but their meaning in life." His eyes darkened for a moment. "My mother sought solace in heroin, my uncle in alcohol, and I vowed that one day I would find a way to change this system." Caitlin blinked, trying to reconcile this man with the image she had created in her articles. "Then why do you support tax breaks for corporations? Why do you oppose raising the minimum wage?" Vance leaned forward, and there was a glint in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Because I don't think in slogans, I think in systems. A $25 minimum wage sounds great until you think about the small businesses in Appalachia that are struggling to make ends meet. The mom-and-pop stores that will close because they can't compete with Amazon and Walmart, which can absorb those costs." He stood up and walked over to the map on the wall. "See those red dots? Those are the cities where Ohio Renaissance has created jobs in the last 5 years. Not high-paying jobs for Ivy League grads, but jobs for people with a community college degree, or none at all. And you know how we did it?" Caitlin shook her head. "Tax breaks for companies that agreed to invest in these cities. The same breaks you call handouts to the rich." Vance returned to the table. "Politics is not a place for ideological purity, Caitlin. It's a place for pragmatic solutions that actually work." She felt as if the ground was slipping from under her feet. Her entire worldview, all the confident statements on her blog, were suddenly called into question. "But why don't you explain it then? Why don't you tell people about the real motives?" Vance smiled with a slight sadness. "Do you really think a complex economic explanation can fit into a 30-second TV spot? That voters want to delve into the nuances of tax policy?" He shook his head. "Politics is the art of the possible, Caitlin. Sometimes you have to speak in simple terms to get complex ideas across." Caitlin opened her notebook, feeling her prepared questions suddenly seem immature and superficial. "Then why am I here?" She looked up at him. "Why do you need a blogger who has been criticizing you for months?" Vance paused, studying her with unexpected intensity. "Because you remind me at your age. The same rage at the system, the same confidence that you know better." He smiled slightly. And the same ability to see what others miss. He pressed a button on the table. Sarah, please bring the Appalachia folder. A minute later, the press secretary appeared with a thin red folder. Vance thanked her and placed the folder in front of Caitlin. This is a project I've been working on for the last 2 years, he said. A federal program to restore the Appalachian economy. I want you to read it and tell me what you think. Caitlin raised her eyebrows in surprise. Me? Why? Because I need an outside perspective. Not one from Harvard economists, not one from political strategists thinking about the next election. Vance looked her in the eye. I need someone who truly cares about ordinary people. Someone who sees the system from below, not from above. Caitlin slowly opened the folder. Inside was a detailed economic development plan, tax incentives to bring manufacturing back to the region, educational programs to retrain workers, investments in infrastructure. It's ambitious, she said, flipping through the pages. And unpopular, Vance added. The right will say it's too expensive. The left will say it's not progressive enough. No one will be entirely happy. Then why do it? Vance stood up and walked over to the photographs on the wall. Because it's right. He pointed to a photo of a crumbling town. That's Middletown where I grew up. When the steel mill closed, the town started dying. People who had taken pride in their work for decades suddenly found themselves unimportant. His voice dropped. My mother was one of them. Caitlin looked at him with new understanding. You said that she became a drug addict. Yes, Vance said, returning to the table. Heroin. She died of an overdose when I was 22. He paused, and Caitlin saw the pain in his eyes that years of political experience couldn't hide. You see, Caitlin, this isn't abstract politics for me. This is personal. Silence fell over the office as Caitlin stared at the plan in her hands, feeling her perception of the man in front of her crumble. I'm sorry, she finally said. I don't need pity, Vance replied calmly. I need people who can help change the system. People with enough passion and intelligence to see beyond the superficial solutions. He looked at her appraisingly. Has it ever occurred to you that you and I want the same thing? We're just going about it in different ways? Caitlin slowly closed the folder. Aram, I don't understand what you're getting at. Vance smiled. I'm offering you a job, Caitlin. She blinked. Work? On my team, he nodded. Not as a press secretary or a staff writer, as a critical voice. Someone who will ask the tough questions before others do. Caitlin felt her heart start to pound. You're asking me to work for an administration that I've been criticizing for months? I'm offering you a chance to change the system from within instead of shouting from the outside, Vance replied. I'm offering you access to the mechanisms of real power. Caitlin shook her head, trying to comprehend what was happening. This is absurd. You want me to betray everything I believe in? To become part of the machine I criticized? No, Vance said firmly. I want you to bring your beliefs inside the system. To ask tough questions of the people making decisions, to represent the voices of those who are not usually allowed at these tables. He paused. You know what's wrong with politics, Caitlin? Too many people with real experience stand aside, letting theorists and careerists rule. Vance leaned forward. You grew up in a working-class family. You waited tables to pay the rent. You know what it's like to worry about the bills. That experience is priceless. Caitlin felt her skepticism warring with unexpected interest. So what? You expect me to just go along with your policies? Become an obedient voice of the administration? Vance laughed, genuinely, truly. God, no. If I needed another willing voice, I'd hire one of the thousands of Ivy League candidates lining up outside that door. He shook his head. I want you to be yourself, to tell me when you think I'm wrong, to represent the perspectives of people we sometimes lose touch with. Caitlin leaned back in her chair, trying to collect her thoughts. This is some kind of political trick, right? A way to silence me? If I wanted to silence you, Vance said calmly, it would have been a lot easier to buy your restaurant and fire you, or use legal leverage to create problems for your blog. He spread his hands. Instead, I reposted your article, giving you a national platform. Why? She asked quietly. Because I liked your honesty, he said simply. Because beneath the fiery rhetoric, I saw genuine concern for people. That's a rare quality, Caitlin, especially in politics. He opened the desk drawer and took out another folder. By the way, I read your articles not only about politics, your essays about life in Cleveland, about the people you grew up with. They are impressive. You have a gift for telling stories that resonate. Caitlin felt the blood rush to her cheeks. You read all this? I have a good team of analysts, Vance smiled, and the ability to read quickly, a useful skill in politics. He placed the second folder in front of her. This is a short description of the position. Title, Special Advisor on Social and Economic Issues. Salary? He quoted a figure that was 5 times what Caitlin was making at the restaurant. Full health insurance. Relocation to Washington if you agree. Caitlin opened the folder with trembling hands. I am not a political scientist. I have no special education. I have enough political scientists, Vance interrupted. I need someone who understands the real world. Someone who has the courage to speak truth to power. He smiled. Even if that power is me. The phone on Vance's desk rang. He glanced at it and sighed. Excuse me, but I have a meeting with the governor in 5 minutes. He stood up. Think about my offer, Caitlin. You can continue writing your critical articles, or you can help me create a policy that will actually make a difference. Caitlin stood up as well, still trying to comprehend what was happening. This is too sudden. I need time. Of course, Vance nodded. You have my contact. Let me know of your decision by the end of the week. He walked her to the door. And Caitlin, whatever you decide, keep writing. Your voice matters. In the reception area, Sarah Chong was already waiting to escort her to the elevator. As they walked away from the office, Caitlin couldn't take it anymore. This is a prank, right? He can't seriously offer me a job. Sarah looked at her with slight surprise. The vice president doesn't waste his time on practical jokes, Ms. Murphy. If he proposed to you, he was dead serious. But why? I wrote terrible things about him. Sarah stopped in front of the elevator. You know, when I first started working with Mr. Vance, I was critical of him too. I was the editor of a progressive magazine, writing articles about how his policies were hurting minorities. She pressed the call button. And then I showed up at a conference where he was speaking, and I asked him a really tough question. Do you know what he did? Caitlin shook her head. He invited me for coffee after the talk, and instead of trying to convince me, he just listened, asked questions, tried to understand my position. Sarah smiled at the memory. A week later, he offered me a job, said he needed people who weren't afraid to argue with him. The elevator arrived and Sarah handed Caitlin a business card. Here's my personal number. If you have any questions about the position or anything, call. Caitlin took the card. Thank you, but I'm still not sure. That's understandable, Sarah nodded. Just remember, Ms. Murphy, there are 2 ways to change a system, shouting from the outside or working from the inside. And trust me, the second way is often more effective. Caitlin walked out of the Capitol in a daze. The sun seemed too bright, the sounds of the city too loud. She passed the black SUV that would take her home and shook her head, indicating that she needed to walk. The agent in the suit nodded understandingly and remained in place, watching her leave. Caitlin walked the streets of Columbus, trying to sort through a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Her entire view of the vice president, of politics, even of herself, had been called into question in 1 short hour. She walked to a small park and sat on a bench, pulling out her phone. Twitter exploded. Her tweet yesterday criticizing the administration, reposted by Vance, had racked up more than 1 million views. Leading political commentators were discussing her, and the New York Times ran a story with the headline, Unknown Blogger Spotted by Vice President. New era of openness or political stunt? Her life had changed overnight. Now she had to decide whether to stay on the outside, criticizing the system, or go inside and try to change it. The phone vibrated. An incoming call from my mother. Caitlin, the voice sounded worried. Are you okay? I saw the news. They said you met with the vice president. Yes, Mom, she answered quietly. I'm okay. What's going on? Why didn't you tell me? Caitlin took a deep breath. It's a long story, but I was offered a job. Work? The mother's voice sounded surprised. What work? In the administration, as an advisor. The words seemed unreal when she said them out loud. Long pause. Are you going to accept the offer? The mother asked cautiously. I don't know, Caitlin answered honestly. It's complicated. Caitlin, her mother's voice became serious. Do you remember what your father always said? There are 2 kinds of people, those who complain about the world and those who change it. Caitlin felt her eyes fill with tears. I remember. He would have been proud of you no matter what you decided, her mother said softly. But he always believed you were the kind of person who would change. After the conversation, Caitlin sat on the bench for a long time, watching people pass by, rushing to work, walking their dogs, living their normal lives. Lives that, for her, could change forever. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Jason. So, are you a big shot now? Let's drink to your glory tonight. She smiled and opened the folder Vance had given her. The Appalachian Plan was ambitious, complex, but something about it resonated with her own ideas. It wasn't a Republican or Democratic agenda. It was a pragmatic approach, focused on real results rather than ideological purity. Caitlin remembered her conversation with Vance. Has it ever occurred to you that you and I want the same thing? We're just going about it in different ways? Maybe he was right. Maybe real change comes not from loud protests and caustic articles, but from painstaking work within the system, from endless compromises and small victories. She stood up, put the folder in her bag, and walked to the vice president's car, which was waiting patiently a block away from the park. The agent opened the door for her without saying a word. "Into the restaurant, please," Caitlin said, climbing inside. "I need to speak to the manager." As the car pulled away, she pulled out her phone and opened a new message. Address, Renewal, Ohio.gov. "Mr. Vice President," she started to type, then stopped and erased. "JD," she wrote instead. "I've made a decision. Let's change the system together. But on one condition, I retain the right to speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. Caitlin Murphy." She hit send and sat back, feeling strangely calm. The path before her was uncharted and dangerous. She could lose her voice, her independence, her beliefs, or she could use this chance to make real change. Not through angry tweets, but through real policies that affect real people's lives. The phone vibrated almost instantly. One word, agreed, DV.